At an ordinary airport gate, a flight attendant stopped a well-dressed black man, doubting he belonged in first class. When he calmly tried to show his ticket, she humiliated him in front of dozens of passengers, even slapping his hand away. But what no one knew, not the crew, not the passengers, not even the captain, was that this quiet man wasn't just any traveler. He was the CEO, and he owned every plane, every seat, and every uniform in the airline. By the time they landed, her entire future would hang on a single decision he was about to make. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss a new one. The airport buzzed with morning noise. Luggage wheels bumped against the floor, people rushed in every direction, and the loudspeakers called out gate numbers over and over. Near gate 17, a tall man stood out from the crowd. His name was Leonard Brooks. He wore a simple charcoal gray suit, polished shoes, and carried only a slim black bag. His short hair was speckled with gray at the sides, and his face held a calm, serious look. He checked the boarding pass in his hand, showing first class, seat 1A. Without rushing, he moved toward the boarding area. Leonard's steps were slow but confident. He didn't look around nervously like some passengers. He didn't fumble with his phone or luggage. Everything about him was steady, like a man who knew exactly where he belonged. But not everyone at the gate seemed to see him that way. Behind the boarding desk stood a young flight attendant named Brittany Cole. She wore a crisp uniform and a bright scarf tied around her neck. Her ponytail was pulled so tight it looked painful. Brittany had a sharp eye for spotting problems. Or so she believed. She liked keeping standards in first class, and she didn't like when someone looked like they didn't fit. As Leonard approached, Brittany's face shifted slightly. Her smile became stiff. Her hand moved quickly to block his path. "Sir," she said, keeping her voice polite but firm, "boarding for economy is down that way." She pointed toward another gate without even looking at his ticket. Leonard raised an eyebrow slightly. He held up his boarding pass in front of her face, his voice even and low. "First class, 1A." For a second, Brittany hesitated. Then she gave the boarding pass a quick glance, barely hiding her surprise. She stepped aside without saying anything else. Leonard passed by without a word, keeping his back straight. But just as he walked onto the jet bridge, Brittany muttered under her breath, "Guess money doesn't always buy class." Leonard didn't react. He moved forward as if the words had never touched him. But behind him, a few passengers heard. A businessman in a navy suit frowned slightly. A woman adjusting her baby's carrier glanced up, her mouth tightening. The comment hung in the air like bad smoke, leaving an uneasy feeling behind. Inside the plane, the first-class cabin glowed with soft lighting. The seats were wide, spaced apart like small private islands. Some passengers were already sipping coffee or tucking blankets over their laps. Leonard found his seat without needing help. He placed his bag in the overhead bin with smooth movements, then sat down and folded his hands neatly in his lap. His eyes closed for a moment, not to sleep but to block out the noise and clear his mind. Brittany entered the cabin a minute later, holding her tablet. Her eyes quickly scanned the rows until they landed on Leonard. Something about seeing him seated there unsettled her. She tightened her grip on the tablet. A voice inside her head whispered that she needed to check again to make sure he belonged there. It wasn't about the ticket, she told herself. It was about doing her job, keeping order. At least, that's what she told herself. She made her way down the aisle, her heels clicking softly against the carpet. Leonard opened his eyes slowly when he felt the presence near him. Brittany stood there stiffly, her expression cold. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass again?" she asked, her voice loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Without speaking, Leonard reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the ticket. He handed it to her with the same calm as before. Brittany snatched it roughly, her fingers brushing against his hand with more force than needed. A man 2 seats away shifted uncomfortably. Brittany stared at the ticket for longer than necessary, looking for a mistake that wasn't there. When she found none, her face grew tight with anger. Without thinking, she shoved the ticket back toward Leonard. Her hands smacked against his fingers hard enough that the ticket slipped free and floated to the floor. A soft gasp rose from the seats behind them. Leonard leaned down slowly, picked up the boarding pass, and straightened again. His face showed no anger, only a deep, silent patience that somehow made Brittany feel smaller than she ever had. "You have no idea who you just disrespected," Leonard said quietly. His voice wasn't raised. He didn't make a scene. But somehow, his calm words sounded louder than any shouting ever could. Brittany blinked, confused for a moment, as a heavy, tense silence spread through the cabin. Passengers stopped pretending not to watch. The air seemed to thicken, every eye drawn to the quiet storm that had just begun at seat 1A. Brittany froze for a second, unsure what to say. She could feel the eyes burning into her back. She quickly straightened her uniform, forcing a tight smile onto her face. "My apologies, sir," she said in a voice that sounded thin and false. "Just following standard checks." But even she knew her words didn't carry any real weight anymore. Leonard did not respond. He simply returned the boarding pass into his jacket pocket and turned his head away, as if Brittany no longer existed. The way he dismissed her without even raising his voice hit harder than any shouting could have. Brittany felt her cheeks burning, and for the first time that morning, a small crack appeared in her perfect professional mask. Trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling, Brittany turned and hurried toward the galley at the front of the plane. She pulled the curtain shut behind her, pretending to check her tablet but really just needing a moment to catch her breath. She told herself it wasn't a big deal, just a misunderstanding, just another difficult passenger. She had handled worse, hadn't she? In the cabin, Leonard sat still. He glanced out of the window, watching the ground crew loading bags below. His face stayed calm, but inside, a storm was already gathering. He had seen this treatment before, too many times. Different faces, different uniforms, but the same attitude hiding behind fake smiles. He wasn't surprised. He was simply waiting. As the final passengers boarded, another flight attendant entered first class. Her name was Heather Blake. She was older than Brittany, with soft brown hair pinned neatly back and kind lines around her eyes. Heather immediately sensed the tension hanging in the cabin. Her gaze swept the room, landing briefly on Leonard. She gave him a small, polite nod, which he returned with the smallest lift of his chin. Heather moved quietly from seat to seat, checking on passengers, offering water and warm towels. She passed Leonard without stopping, sensing somehow that he wanted to be left alone for now. Across the cabin, Brittany stayed near the galley, pretending to study the safety checklist. But no amount of pretending could erase the feeling growing inside her, the feeling that something was wrong. The way Leonard had looked at her wasn't angry or rude. It was worse. It was a warning she had not yet understood. At that moment, the intercom crackled, and the captain's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 727 with direct service to Atlanta. We are just finishing our final checks and should be pushing back shortly." Passengers relaxed into their seats. Some closed their eyes. Some pulled out books. The tension seemed to ease. For them, but not for Brittany. She stood rigid behind the galley curtain, tablet clutched tightly in her hands, heart beating a little faster than before. She couldn't explain it, but she had the strange feeling that this flight was not going to be like any other flight she had worked. And deep in seat 1A, Leonard sat quietly, watching the sky beyond the glass, knowing exactly what was coming. The plane rolled back from the gate, and the engines hummed louder as it lined up for takeoff. Inside the first-class cabin, the soft chime of the seatbelt sign turning off brought a quiet shuffle of movement. Flight attendants moved down the aisles with trays of drinks, their smiles practiced and polite. Heather passed Leonard again, offering him a drink, but he simply shook his head. He didn't need anything yet. He was waiting. Brittany stayed at the far end of the cabin, her steps careful, her smile stiff. She couldn't get Leonard's voice out of her head. "You have no idea who you just disrespected." The words looped over and over, each time heavier than the last. Every time she looked at him seated so calmly in 1A, her stomach twisted tighter. She told herself she had followed procedure. She told herself appearances mattered. But none of her usual excuses seemed strong enough now. Across the aisle, a businessman in a crisp blue suit opened his laptop. He glanced toward Leonard more than once, sensing that something had happened. Near the window, a middle-aged woman sipped wine and pretended to read a magazine, though her eyes kept flickering up from the pages. The cabin buzzed with unspoken tension, like a room where everyone felt a storm coming but no one dared speak of it. Leonard sat quietly, hands folded in his lap, his eyes half closed. But inside he measured every move, every glance, every silence. He had spent years in rooms where he wasn't expected to belong. Airports, meetings, boardrooms. It was all the same. He had built something bigger than most could imagine. Yet small minds could only see his skin, his clothes, his quietness. Today would be no different. Except today, the consequences would not be hidden. After a while, Brittany made herself walk down the aisle again. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she neared Leonard's seat. She glanced at him quickly, pretending she wasn't nervous, pretending she wasn't still defending herself in her own mind. "Would you like a drink, sir?" she asked, her voice almost robotic. Leonard looked up at her, his eyes calm but sharp. "No, thank you," he said, his tone polite but heavy, making even those 3 words feel like a warning. Brittany nodded quickly and moved on, her hand shaking slightly as she pushed the service cart forward. In the galley, she leaned against the wall for a second, breathing hard. She wiped her palms on the sides of her skirt, trying to calm herself. This wasn't supposed to happen. First class was supposed to be smooth, easy, predictable. But somehow one mistake, one assumption, was now standing in the middle of her perfect flight, and she didn't know how to fix it. She didn't know that it was already too late. The flight settled into a steady rhythm as the plane leveled out high above the clouds. Trays clattered softly, cups were filled, and the faint scent of coffee drifted through the air. But the uneasy feeling in the first-class cabin never went away. Leonard sat still, his hands resting lightly on the armrests, his face unreadable. From time to time, passengers glanced his way, sensing something different about him, something they couldn't quite name. Near the front, Brittany kept glancing at her tablet, pretending to check service lists. Her mind raced, running over every second of the boarding process, trying to convince herself she hadn't done anything wrong. Maybe he was just another unhappy passenger. Maybe he would cool off. Maybe by the time they landed, it would all be forgotten. But deep down, Brittany knew she had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. Halfway through the flight, a man in a dark suit came quietly down the aisle. He wasn't part of the regular crew. His suit was sharper, his shoes shinier. His badge, tucked neatly on his jacket, showed he was someone important. His name was Douglas Price, and he was a senior operations manager for the airline, flying today on a routine inspection trip. Most of the crew hadn't even noticed him board earlier. Douglas paused near first class, scanning the cabin with careful eyes. When he saw Leonard, his face shifted instantly. His stiff professional look softened into something almost respectful. Without hesitation, Douglas stepped forward and bent slightly at the waist, a small but clear sign of recognition. "Good afternoon, sir," Douglas said in a low voice. "Please let me know if there's anything you need." Leonard nodded once, acknowledging him. The exchange was short, but for those paying attention, it spoke volumes. Brittany, standing near the galley, watched the scene with confusion tightening in her chest. Why would a senior manager show that kind of respect to a passenger? Her mind raced, piecing together things she didn't understand. Douglas moved away after a moment, leaving Leonard in silence once again. But now, the air in first class felt heavier. Brittany felt it pressing against her, and so did a few of the passengers sitting nearby. The quiet glances toward Leonard grew more curious, more cautious. Something wasn't normal here. Brittany gripped the back of a seat, her knuckles turning white. She tried to steady herself, but her legs felt shaky. Part of her wanted to hide in the galley and wait for the flight to end. Another part, the stubborn part, refused to believe she had done anything serious. It was just a misunderstanding, she told herself again. clinging to the thought like a lifeline. But deep inside, fear was already starting to bloom. The plane continued slicing through the clouds, steady and smooth, but the tension inside the cabin only thickened. Brittany adjusted the collar of her uniform, feeling sweat at the back of her neck. She tried to keep busy, refilling glasses and straightening headrests, but her mind wasn't with her hands anymore. Every few minutes, her eyes flickered back to seat 1A, where Leonard remained as still as a mountain. Passengers around Leonard seemed to sense the weight too. The businessman across the aisle closed his laptop without finishing his email. The woman with the magazine hadn't turned a page in 10 minutes. Even the young couple near the front, who'd been giggling over a movie, now sat more quietly, sneaking glances toward Leonard and then toward Brittany. Brittany hated the feeling. She wasn't used to being watched. She was used to controlling the room, setting the tone, making sure first class felt exclusive. But now she felt trapped, like every move she made was being measured. She moved faster, trying to stay ahead of her thoughts, but they chased her down the narrow aisles like shadows she couldn't outrun. Douglas Price had taken a seat 2 rows back, flipping through a report but glancing up now and then at Leonard. His face remained neutral, but his respect for Leonard was clear in every glance. Brittany caught herself staring at him too long and quickly turned away, her heart hammering against her ribs. At the front of the cabin, Heather noticed the growing tension. She whispered quietly to Brittany as they passed each other in the aisle. "Everything all right?" Brittany forced a smile so tight it hurt. "Fine, just first flight nerves," she whispered back, brushing past quickly before Heather could ask more. But Heather wasn't convinced. She had been working flights long enough to know when something wasn't right. And whatever was happening here, it wasn't normal turbulence. Another hour passed. Drinks were served, trays cleared, lights dimmed slightly for the afternoon flight. It should have felt peaceful. It didn't. Every step Brittany took past seat 1A felt heavier, like she was walking through water. She didn't dare make eye contact with Leonard anymore. She told herself that maybe once they landed, everything would blow over. Maybe he would just file a complaint, and it would go into a folder with a dozen others, and she would get a small warning and move on. That's how things usually worked, wasn't it? But deep down, a colder voice whispered something she didn't want to hear. This isn't going to be just a complaint. Just before the descent announcement, the curtain to the first-class galley pulled back sharply. Brittany jumped slightly. Douglas Price stood there, his expression serious now. "Miss Cole," he said, his voice low but firm. She straightened her shoulders, instinct taking over. "Yes, sir." "I need you to prepare for a passenger announcement," Douglas said. "We'll be making it shortly before landing." Brittany blinked. That was strange. Flight announcements didn't usually involve first-class passengers directly. Before she could ask anything, Douglas added, "And after that, you'll be expected to come forward." Her mouth opened, then closed. She couldn't find the words. Douglas didn't explain further. He simply gave a short nod and disappeared behind the curtain again. Brittany stood frozen in place, clutching the service cart like it might anchor her. The fear she had been pushing down all flight long surged up her throat like a rising tide. Whatever was about to happen, it was bigger than she thought. Much bigger. She glanced once more toward Leonard. He sat calmly in his seat, looking out of the window, one hand resting lightly on his knee. He looked like a man waiting for something. And Brittany knew, with a cold, sinking certainty, that he wasn't waiting for the flight to land. He was waiting for her world to change. The minutes dragged like hours. Every second felt stretched thin, like the whole cabin was holding its breath. Brittany stood near the galley, pretending to organize trays, but mostly gripping the counter to keep her hands from shaking. She kept replaying the morning in her head, every look, every word, trying to find some way to explain it all if someone asked. But deep down, she knew explanations wouldn't save her. Not this time. The loudspeaker chimed, and the captain's voice broke the heavy silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we begin our descent, please return to your seats and ensure your seatbelts are fastened. We will have an important message shortly." Thank you passengers shuffled in their seats, buckling up, adjusting pillows. But even among the usual landing preparations, something felt different. Eyes darted around the cabin, curious and nervous. Everyone sensed something bigger was coming, even if they didn't understand it yet. Leonard remained seated in 1A, his face calm, untouched by the tension he had quietly built around him. He leaned back slightly, folding his hands together, looking every bit like a man at peace, or maybe a man ready to deliver a judgment. Douglas Price stepped forward, carrying a small wireless microphone. His face was calm but serious, his footsteps slow and steady. Brittany's stomach twisted into tighter knots as she watched him. She had never seen a senior manager take over the speaker during a flight. Not once. Whatever was happening wasn't routine. Douglas cleared his throat and the cabin went completely silent. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice strong and steady, "we would like to take a moment to acknowledge a very important guest traveling with us today in seat 1A. Heads turned instantly toward Leonard, some passengers leaning into the aisles to see better. Brittany's knees nearly gave out. Her hands gripped the counter behind her until her knuckles turned white. Douglas continued, "It is our great honor to welcome Mr. Leonard Brooks, founder, chairman, and chief executive officer of Horizon Airways, the parent company of the airline you are flying with today." A ripple of gasps ran through the cabin. Mouths opened in shock. Passengers exchanged wide-eyed glances. Even Heather, who had worked for the airline for years, stood rooted in place, her mouth slightly open. Brittany felt the blood drain from her face. Her ears rang so loudly she barely heard the rest of Douglas's words. She stared at Leonard, frozen in her spot, her body refusing to move, her mind refusing to accept what she had just heard. Leonard Brooks wasn't just a first-class passenger. He wasn't just a businessman. He was the owner of the entire airline, the man whose name she had seen 100 times on company newsletters, plaques in training rooms, photos at award ceremonies. The man she had brushed aside without a second thought. The man she had doubted, disrespected, shoved aside like he didn't belong. Douglas handed the microphone to Leonard with a respectful nod. Leonard stood up slowly, towering above the stunned cabin. His movements were smooth, measured, full of quiet authority. He looked out at the passengers, at the crew, his gaze sharp, but not cruel. He raised the microphone to his mouth, and in a voice that was calm and powerful at the same time, he spoke. "It's important to remember something. Respect is not worn on the outside. It's not stitched into a jacket or pinned to a name badge. It's in how we treat people when we think no one is watching." A deep silence filled the cabin. Passengers listened without blinking. Brittany stood behind the curtain, unable to move, feeling every word slice through her. Leonard's eyes scanned the cabin, landing briefly, pointedly, on Brittany, even though he said nothing more about her directly. The look was enough. It was a mirror, forcing her to see herself as she really was, not the version she had always believed. Leonard handed the microphone back to Douglas with a quiet thank you. Then he sat down again, crossing one leg calmly over the other, as if he had never been disturbed in the first place. The silence in the cabin stretched long after the announcement ended. It wasn't the silence of boredom. It was the heavy, thick silence of people seeing something they could not forget. Brittany stood there, frozen, feeling as if the floor beneath her feet had disappeared completely. The wheels of the plane touched down with a soft thud, and a collective breath seemed to escape the cabin. But the relief of landing was not enough to erase the tension that hung like thick smoke in the air. The passengers remained unusually quiet, stealing glances at Leonard Brooks, who sat with the same calm dignity he had held from the beginning. As the plane taxied to the gate, the flight attendants moved through the final motions of securing the cabin. Heather moved quietly and professionally, but her eyes often drifted toward Brittany, who stood stiffly by the galley, her hands clasped so tightly behind her back they trembled. Heather didn't ask any questions. She could see enough in Brittany's pale face and lowered eyes. Brittany wanted to disappear. Every second stretched painfully long. Her throat was dry. Her heart thumped loudly in her ears. She couldn't believe how badly things had spiraled out of control. She had made assumptions without thinking. She had acted with arrogance without even realizing it at the time. And now, She had disrespected not just any passenger, but the man who literally owned the airline she worked for. The plane finally came to a stop at the gate. The familiar sound of the seatbelt sign turning off clicked through the cabin, but still, no one rushed to their feet. It was as if the normal rhythm of travel had been suspended, held back by the unseen weight pressing down on them. Then Douglas appeared at the front of the cabin once again. His face was even more serious now. He held a small folder in his hand, and when he spoke, his voice was low but carried a tone that demanded attention. "Miss Cole," he said, addressing Brittany without needing to raise his voice, "please step forward." The word struck her like a blow. She hesitated for half a second, but then her feet moved on their own. She walked stiffly down the aisle, her head down, feeling every pair of eyes follow her. The walk from the galley to the front of the plane felt longer than any walk she had ever taken in her life. She stopped near the first row, standing awkwardly beside Douglas, wishing she could shrink into nothing. Leonard remained seated, his eyes on her, calm but unreadable. Douglas cleared his throat. "Due to the events witnessed by passengers and crew today, and due to a direct violation of our company's ethics and customer service standards, Flight Attendant Brittany Cole will be removed from duty immediately pending an internal review." A gasp echoed from a few seats. Someone dropped a magazine onto the floor. Brittany's face flushed hot and cold all at once. Her hands shook as she struggled to keep them at her sides. Douglas continued, "An apology is not just expected, it is necessary. Miss Cole, the floor is yours." The silence was so thick it was almost hard to breathe. Brittany opened her mouth, but for a long second no words came out. Her throat closed up, shame and fear locking inside her chest. But there was no way out now, no excuse strong enough, no defense left to hide behind. She turned to face Leonard fully, her eyes struggling to meet his. When she finally spoke, her voice was small, but it carried through the cabin because of the deep quiet that surrounded them. I am deeply sorry for the way I treated you today, sir," she said, her voice trembling. "I made assumptions I had no right to make. I showed disrespect where I should have shown professionalism and kindness. I let my judgment and pride blind me. I humiliated you without cause, and for that I am truly ashamed." Her eyes burned, but she blinked the tears back. This wasn't the time for crying. It was the time for facing what she had done. Leonard listened without changing his expression. He didn't rush to interrupt her. He didn't soften or frown. He simply listened, giving her the full weight of her own words back in silence. When Brittany finished, she stood still, her head slightly bowed. She had no idea what would happen next. Part of her expected Leonard to unleash anger, to demand she be fired on the spot, to humiliate her the way she had humiliated him. But Leonard only nodded once, slow and measured. Then he stood up. Even standing in the quiet cabin, he didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. His presence alone was enough. "You can't undo a moment once it's past," Leonard said calmly, his voice carrying the weight of years of experience, of battles fought and dignity defended. "But you can choose what you become after it. Remember that." He didn't look at her with hatred. He didn't speak with cruelty. He offered something much heavier. A chance to become better, or to fall even further. Leonard picked up his bag from the overhead bin without any help, adjusted his jacket and walked calmly toward the exit. The passengers parted silently to let him through, some nodding respectfully as he passed. No one spoke. No one needed to. Brittany remained standing at the front of the plane, her shoulders trembling, the sound of Leonard's footsteps fading behind her, and with them, the version of herself she could no longer return to. The moment Leonard stepped off the plane, it felt like the very air changed. It was lighter somehow, but not for Brittany. She remained frozen at the front of the cabin, her hands still locked together in front of her, every muscle in her body stiff with shame. Around her, the other passengers began to move at last, standing up, gathering their bags, speaking in hushed voices. But even their movements were slower, more careful than usual, like they all knew they had witnessed something they shouldn't forget too easily. Heather passed by Brittany on her way to help a passenger with an overhead bin. She gave Brittany a brief look, not cruel, not smug, but heavy with understanding. Heather had seen many mistakes over her years, but she had never seen one like this unfold so publicly, with no place left for anyone to hide. Brittany barely heard the usual goodbye announcements over the speakers. Her mind was stuck, replaying Leonard's words again and again. You can't undo a moment once it's past, but you can choose what you become after it. She felt like she was standing at a cliff's edge, and there was no safe way back to where she had been. As the last passengers left the cabin, Douglas Price approached her again. He didn't yell, he didn't threaten. He simply handed her a printed letter that had clearly been prepared during the final part of the flight. You're relieved of duty for now, he said firmly. Security will escort you to the crew office when you step off the aircraft. You'll meet with the disciplinary board tomorrow morning. Brittany took the letter with trembling fingers. The words blurred in front of her eyes, but she knew what it said even without reading it fully. Suspension pending investigation, immediate review of conduct, recommendation for mandatory sensitivity and diversity training. Terms that felt heavy and cold compared to the pride she once felt wearing her uniform. Douglas hesitated before walking away. He lowered his voice so only Brittany could hear. You should know. Mr. Brooks is not a man who embarrasses people for pleasure. If he called you out like that, it's because he believes people can change if they're given the choice to. Brittany nodded slowly, unable to form any words in return. Douglas gave her one last look, half warning, half mercy, and then disappeared down the jet bridge after the passengers. Brittany stood alone in the hollow cabin. The faint smell of coffee and fabric cleaner filled the air. The seats were empty now, pillows left crumpled, safety cards sticking out of pockets. The cabin that once felt like a kingdom she ruled now felt like a courtroom where she had just lost everything. She made her way down the aisle slowly, her feet heavy, her head bowed. Every step reminded her of the countless flights she had walked with pride, thinking she was better, thinking she was right to judge who belonged and who didn't. Now, those same steps felt like a trail of mistakes she couldn't erase. At the aircraft door, 2 uniformed security officers stood waiting. Their faces were blank, professional, but Brittany felt their judgment without them saying a single word. She nodded stiffly and followed them down the empty jet bridge. As she walked, she caught a glimpse through the wide airport windows. In the distance, Leonard Brooks stood near a row of black cars waiting outside the terminal. A driver held the door open for him. He paused for a moment before getting in, looking back toward the terminal, as if remembering something. Brittany wondered if he was thinking of her, or if she was already just another forgotten mistake in a long career of people underestimating him. But deep inside, she knew the truth. She would never forget him. When she reached the crew office, she sat alone at a plain wooden table, her badge and ID placed in a small envelope before her. She was no longer a flight attendant for now. She was just Brittany Cole, a woman who had to sit in the silence she had created, face the reflection she had avoided for too long, and decide what kind of person she was going to become. Outside the room, airport announcements echoed through the halls. Flights were still taking off, business still moving forward. The world didn't stop for one person's mistakes. But for Brittany, time had slowed to a painful crawl, forcing her to feel every second of what she had lost. Not just a job, not just a reputation, but a piece of herself. The part that once thought she knew what fairness looked like, without ever truly understanding it. She sat there staring at the floor with the heavy silence pressing down, knowing the hardest part of her journey was only just beginning. The small windowless room where Brittany sat smelled faintly of stale coffee and old carpet. A ticking clock on the wall counted the seconds loudly, as if mocking her. She stared at the plain table in front of her, the envelope containing her badge and ID looking like a funeral for her career. She folded her hands tightly in her lap, trying to keep them from trembling, but the cold air inside the room made the effort useless. Hours seemed to pass, though the clock told her it was only 40 minutes. No one had come to speak with her yet. No supervisor, no counselor, no friend. Just the quiet shuffle of footsteps outside the door, as other crew members passed by without looking in. Maybe they knew what had happened already. Maybe whispers were already flying through the break rooms and hallways. Brittany Cole embarrassed the airline in front of its own owner. The shame sat heavy in her chest, thick and suffocating. She replayed every moment in her head. The way she had spoken, the way she had brushed Leonard aside without giving him the basic respect he deserved. She saw again how calm he had been, how he hadn't needed to raise his voice or insult her back. He had just stood there letting her dig her own grave with every foolish word she had spoken. There had been a time, not long ago, when Brittany had been proud to wear her uniform. She used to think of herself as a gatekeeper of high standards. She had believed she was protecting the dignity of first class, making sure it stayed special. But now, sitting in that cold little room, she realized how small-minded that pride had been. She had confused respect with appearances, kindness with judgment. And the worst part was knowing that no one had made her act that way. No one had forced her to assume Leonard didn't belong in first class. No one had made her snatch the ticket from his hand, mutter insults under her breath, or shove his dignity aside. Those choices were hers, and hers alone. The door creaked open, breaking the heavy silence. A woman in a navy blue blazer stepped in, carrying a clipboard. Her name tag read Karen Lewis, Crew Supervisor. Her face was calm, but there was no softness in her eyes. "Brittany," she said simply, sitting down across the table. She placed the clipboard between them and adjusted her glasses. "You understand why you're here?" Brittany nodded once, her throat too dry to speak. Karen continued, her voice even, almost clinical. "We have reviewed the preliminary incident reports, passenger recordings, and statements from the cabin crew. A full disciplinary meeting is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Until then, your status is suspended without pay." Brittany nodded again, her head heavy. "There are two options," Karen said. "You can resign voluntarily before the meeting. It would end the review, but there would still be a permanent note in your employment record. Or you can attend the meeting, face the board, and accept their decision, whatever that may be." Brittany swallowed hard. Her mind screamed at her to quit now, to run, to hide from the shame. But another part of her, smaller but louder, said she couldn't run anymore. She had run from facing her own faults for too long. "I'll attend," Brittany said, her voice hoarse but steady. Karen studied her for a long moment, then gave a small nod of approval. "Very well. Be here at 8 sharp tomorrow morning. Wear civilian clothes. Bring no uniform items." The instructions were clear. Brittany was not a flight attendant now. She was just another employee facing consequences. Karen stood, gathering her clipboard. She hesitated at the door, looking back once. "For what it's worth," she said, her voice dropping slightly, "Mr. Brooks could have demanded your firing on the spot. No hearing, no review. Just a termination letter waiting for you when you stepped off that plane." Brittany looked up, her eyes wide. "But he didn't," Karen said. "He wanted you to be given a chance, don't waste it." With that, Karen walked out, closing the door behind her. Brittany sat still, stunned. She had expected anger, revenge, humiliation. Instead, Leonard had chosen something harder: mercy. A mercy that didn't erase her wrongdoing but forced her to face it in the open, with no excuses left to cling to. That night, Brittany barely slept. She sat in her small apartment, staring at the dark window, the city lights blinking in the distance. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Leonard's face, heard his words. Respect isn't worn, it's shown. And somewhere deep inside, a painful understanding began to grow. It was not enough to apologize. It was not enough to feel sorry for herself. Real change would hurt. It would demand everything she had tried to hide from. Tomorrow she would walk into that boardroom, not as the proud Brittany Cole who thought she knew better, but as someone stripped bare, someone who would have to rebuild from the ground up. And for the first time in her life she understood. That might be the hardest and most important flight she would ever take. The morning came far too quickly. Brittany stood in front of her closet, staring at the rows of neatly pressed uniforms she could no longer wear. For a moment her hand hovered over the sharp navy jacket she had once put on with pride, back when she thought the uniform made her someone important. But today, that uniform would stay on the hanger. She chose a simple black blouse and gray slacks instead, her hands trembling slightly as she buttoned the cuffs. She caught her reflection in the mirror, pale, tired, older than she remembered looking just days ago. The drive to the airline's headquarters felt surreal. The streets she normally breezed through on the way to work now seemed endless, heavy with dread. Every stoplight seemed to hold her a little longer, making her heart thud painfully in her chest. She parked far from the main entrance, not wanting to face the familiar faces who might be watching, who might already know what had happened. Inside the building, the walls that once felt so familiar now seemed colder, taller. The framed pictures of smiling crews and ribbon-cutting ceremonies lined the hallway, and in the middle of many of those pictures was Leonard Brooks, smiling politely, shaking hands, standing tall. Brittany couldn't look at those photos for long. Her footsteps echoed too loudly as she walked toward the conference room where her hearing would be held. At the door, a heavy-set man with a crew cut, Mr. Donald Harris from the Human Resources Department, waited with a clipboard in hand. He gave her a curt nod and motioned her inside without a word. The room was plain, functional. A long table stretched across the center, lined with 5 serious faces. 2 supervisors, 1 HR manager, a union representative, and a senior pilot acting as a neutral observer. A recording device sat in the middle of the table, its red light blinking steadily. Brittany swallowed her fear and sat in the lone chair facing them. The HR manager, a woman with iron-gray hair named Judith Spencer, leaned forward and spoke first. "Miss Cole, you are here today to respond to allegations of professional misconduct, racial bias, and violation of Horizon Airways Code of Ethics during Flight 727 from Chicago to Atlanta yesterday." The words hit hard, though Brittany had expected them. Hearing them spoken aloud made the shame burn hotter in her chest. Judith continued, her voice clinical. "You may give a statement now, or we can proceed directly to questions." Brittany hesitated only for a breath before answering. "I would like to give a statement," she said, her voice shaking slightly. The board members nodded, and the room fell silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Brittany folded her hands tightly in front of her on the table, grounding herself. "I want to be clear from the beginning. I am responsible for my actions. No excuses can change what I did. I treated Mr. Brooks with disrespect, based on assumptions I made without cause. I judged him without knowing him, without giving him the basic courtesy that every passenger deserves, no matter who they are or where they sit." She paused, gathering herself. Her throat tightened, but she pushed through. "I acted from a place of pride, not professionalism. I let my own bias, whether I admitted it to myself or not, guide my behavior. It was wrong. It was ugly. And it betrayed the trust this company placed in me when they gave me that uniform." The board members listened carefully, not interrupting. "I humiliated a man who deserved nothing but respect, not because of his title, but because he is a human being. I embarrassed myself, my team, and this company. I regret it deeply, and I accept whatever consequences come from my actions." Brittany finished speaking, her chest rising and falling with each heavy breath. The silence that followed was heavier than anything she had ever felt. She didn't beg. She didn't plead. She had no more lies to tell herself. The supervisors asked a few questions, basic ones about the timeline, her behavior, the procedures she had broken. Brittany answered each one honestly, never trying to minimize her actions. Every truth felt like another cut, but she knew it was better to bleed now than to keep hiding. Finally, the union representative, a quiet man named Charles Reed, spoke. His voice was softer than the others. "Miss Cole," he said, "do you believe this experience has changed your understanding of what your role truly is?" Brittany looked him straight in the eye. "Yes," she said. "I used to think my job was to control who belonged where, to protect some invisible image of what first class was supposed to look like. But that's not the job. The job is to make every passenger feel welcome, respected, and safe, no matter what I think they should look like. I forgot that. I will never forget it again." Charles nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. Judith looked down at her papers, then back at Brittany, Thank you, Miss Cole. The board will discuss the matter now. Please wait outside. Brittany stood up slowly, her knees weak but holding. She stepped into the empty hallway, the door closing quietly behind her. For the next 20 minutes, she sat on a hard bench staring at the blank wall across from her. She didn't pray. She didn't plead. She simply sat with herself, truly sat with who she had become for the first time in her life. When the door finally opened and they called her back inside, she stood up straight, ready to face whatever came next, not because she expected mercy, but because she had decided that, no matter what happened, this would be the day she began to change. Whether they gave her a second chance or not, she would never again be the woman who boarded Flight 727 2 days ago. And for the first time in a long time, Brittany understood that losing her old life might be the only way to truly find a better one. The board members sat with a new seriousness when Brittany returned to the room. The clipboard Judith held was filled with notes, and the recording light blinked steadily on the table. Brittany stood quietly in front of them, her hands loosely at her sides, no longer gripping herself for strength. If strength came now, it would have to come from within. Judith cleared her throat before speaking. Miss Cole, after careful discussion, we have reached a decision. Brittany braced herself. She expected the words termination, discharge, dismissal. She had spent the last half hour preparing herself for the worst, knowing she deserved no less. But what came was something different, something she hadn't dared hope for. You will not be immediately terminated, Judith said, her tone clear but firm. Instead, you are placed on final warning status. You will be suspended without pay for 60 days. During this period, you are required to complete advanced cultural sensitivity and leadership training at your own expense. Brittany let out a slow, shaky breath, hardly believing what she was hearing. You will also complete 40 hours of community service in a program selected by the airline, Judith continued. Failure to complete any part of this requirement will result in immediate dismissal without further review. The room remained completely silent. Brittany nodded slowly, her voice cracking slightly as she answered, I understand. Charles Reed, the union representative, spoke next. His voice was steady but more personal. Miss Cole, you are being given a rare second chance. Not many are afforded such mercy, especially after such a public mistake. Brittany lowered her head slightly, feeling the truth of his words settle deep into her bones. Leonard Brooks himself contacted the board this morning, Judith said, pausing to let the words land. He specifically requested that you be given a chance for redemption rather than immediate termination. He said, and I quote, real leadership is shown not by how hard you punish, but by how much you invest in others' ability to rise after falling. The words hit Brittany harder than any punishment could have. Leonard Brooks, the man she had wronged so deeply, had spoken for her when she had no right to ask for it. He had given her something she had not even given him at first sight: humanity. Tears filled her eyes, but she blinked them back, not wanting pity, only resolve. You will report back in 60 days after completing all requirements for a final review before returning to active duty, Judith finished. Until then, consider this an opportunity to rebuild not only your career, but also the values you stand for. The meeting ended with the clicking of pens and the quiet shuffle of papers. No applause, no smiles, just the solemn, heavy air of responsibility shifting from the board onto Brittany's shoulders. She left the room feeling lighter in one way, but burdened in another. Redemption was not given freely. It was work, hard and humbling, and she hadn't even begun to earn it yet. In the parking lot, the sun was high, casting sharp shadows across the concrete. Brittany leaned against her small car, staring at the clouds drifting lazily across the bright blue sky. In a strange way, she felt like the world looked different now. Harsher, maybe, but also clearer. The illusions she once wrapped herself in were gone. She drove straight to a small library downtown, the only quiet place she could think of. She sat at a computer, pulled up applications for community service programs, and began reading about cultural history, racial equality, and leadership ethics. Not because anyone told her to, because something inside her knew that a single class wouldn't be enough. 60 days wouldn't be enough. Change wasn't a checklist. It was a lifetime of unlearning and choosing to be better every single day. At first, every article she read felt like a slap, a painful reminder of how blind she had been. But slowly, those slaps became lessons. Every story of injustice, every piece of history she had once skimmed over, now pierced deeper. She saw herself not just in the wrong she had done to Leonard Brooks, but in the small daily wrongs that people like him faced all the time. Wrong looks, wrong assumptions, wrong words whispered when they thought no one would hear. Brittany realized that being good wasn't about big speeches or grand gestures. It was about 1,000 small choices when no one was watching. It would be easy to walk away, to quit, to tell herself it was too late. But Brittany had already made the easy choices too many times before. This time she would stay in the discomfort. She would do the work, and whether or not Horizon Airways ever let her put on a uniform again, she promised herself that she would never, ever forget who she had been and who she had the chance to become. The following weeks moved slowly for Brittany, each day pushing her a little further from who she used to be. Her mornings, once filled with the rush of flight schedules and crew briefings, were now spent volunteering at a local shelter that served displaced families. Her afternoons were given over to mandatory workshops, ones that forced her to sit with discomfort, to confront hard truths about prejudice, power, and the tiny daily decisions that could uplift or crush another human being. The first few days at the shelter were brutal. Brittany had expected to be uncomfortable, but she hadn't expected to be invisible. Most of the families barely acknowledged her at first, their smiles cautious, their eyes tired. Many of the people she served were Black, Hispanic, or immigrants from countries she barely knew anything about. She realized quickly that her uniform, her title, her old pride, none of it mattered here. The only thing that did was the way she showed up moment after moment. At first, she stayed quiet, afraid to say the wrong thing. She scrubbed kitchen floors, sorted through donated clothes, and carried boxes until her back ached. She thought she was doing enough by working hard. But one afternoon, a woman named Gloria, a regular volunteer with soft eyes and a sharp tongue, pulled her aside. "You work hard," Gloria said, wiping her hands on her apron. "But you're still hiding, girl." Brittany blinked, unsure what to say. "Working hard is good," Gloria said, looking straight into her. "But these people don't need another pair of hands. They need to see your heart. They need you to listen, not just serve." That night, Brittany lay awake replaying Gloria's words. For years, she had convinced herself that being efficient, being strict, meant she was doing her job well. She had measured her success by how cleanly she enforced rules, how neatly she kept order. But real service wasn't about order. It was about connection, about seeing people, truly seeing them, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it meant stepping outside of the neat little walls she had built around herself. The next day, Brittany tried differently. She didn't just serve food. She sat with a young boy and listened to him talk about the school he missed. She didn't just hand out donated clothes. She knelt on the floor next to a mother helping her daughter find a winter coat, laughing quietly when the little girl spun around, modeling it like a runway star. She didn't hide behind tasks anymore. Slowly, the walls between her and the people she was helping began to crack. A few smiles came more easily. Conversations started lasting longer. Names were remembered. One evening, near the end of her shift, a small boy with a backpack too big for his shoulders tugged on her sleeve. When she bent down, he handed her a folded piece of paper. She opened it carefully. It was a crayon drawing, crooked, colorful. And right in the center was a picture of her handing a sandwich to a line of stick figures. Over the top, in shaky letters, the boy had written, "Thank you for seeing me." Brittany's chest tightened so painfully she thought she might not be able to breathe. She realized that the boy had given her something she hadn't even known she needed. Forgiveness, yes, but also something rarer. A reminder that change was possible, that every day was a chance to rebuild trust, piece by piece, choice by choice. As the 60th day approached, Brittany completed her final workshop sessions. She sat through discussions about unconscious bias, systemic injustice, and the power of small kindnesses. She didn't just take notes for the sake of passing. She absorbed every word, letting them settle into the cracks of who she was becoming. One of her final assignments was to write a reflection on her experience. She didn't struggle with the words. They flowed easily now, raw and honest. She wrote about her arrogance, her blind spots, her painful mistakes. She wrote about Leonard Brooks, not just about what had happened on that plane, but about what he had taught her without ever raising his voice. That real power doesn't come from position or authority. Real power comes from dignity, from restraint, from the choice to offer a hand up when revenge would have been so much easier. On her final evening before her review, Brittany stood outside the airline headquarters once again. The building loomed above her, just as imposing as it had been 60 days ago, but she was different now. She didn't clutch her uniform for comfort. She didn't walk in armored with pride. She walked in carrying only herself, flawed, humbled, but willing. She knew she might not get her old job back. She knew that forgiveness didn't erase consequences. But she also knew something deeper, something she had never truly understood before. Redemption wasn't something anyone could hand to her. It was something she had to build, choice by choice, day by day. And standing under the sharp white lights of the lobby, Brittany Cole decided once and for all that even if she had to build it the hard way, she would. Brittany sat once again in the familiar conference room, the long table stretched out in front of her like a road she had to walk carefully. But this time she didn't sit with trembling hands or darting eyes. She sat straight, both feet planted firmly on the floor, a folder in front of her filled with her completed coursework, service hours, and her written reflection. She wasn't here to plead. She wasn't here to beg for another chance. She was here to own who she had become. Across the table sat the same board members. Their faces were serious, but not hostile. Charles Reed, the union representative, gave her a small nod when she entered. A small but important sign that someone was rooting for her to succeed, not just to survive this moment. Judith Spencer began the meeting, her voice steady. Miss Cole, you have completed the suspension period and submitted all required documentation. Today, we will hear your final statement and decide whether your employment with Horizon Airways will be reinstated or permanently terminated. Brittany nodded. I understand. Judith gestured for her to begin. Brittany opened the folder but didn't look at it. Instead, she spoke from memory, from heart. I was given a gift most people never get, she said, her voice clear. A second chance. I didn't deserve it when Mr. Brooks chose to give it to me. I had treated him, and by extension every passenger I ever judged unfairly, with arrogance and blindness. She paused, letting the words settle. I thought being strict meant being professional. I thought keeping up appearances made the airline better. But I see now that real strength comes from lifting people up, not shutting them out. Real professionalism means treating everyone, and with dignity. Not just the ones who look a certain way or fit a certain mold. She took a breath. My 60 days weren't just a punishment, they were a mirror. Every shift at the shelter, every workshop, every uncomfortable conversation forced me to see myself without excuses. I am not the same person who boarded Flight 727. And I won't pretend I'm done learning. Growth isn't something that happens once. It's every day. Brittany reached for the crayon drawing tucked inside her folder. She held it up, the child's crooked, colorful image of her handing out sandwiches. This, she said, her voice soft but steady, is what matters. Seeing people, respecting them, not for what they wear, or what they buy, or what seat they sit in, but simply because they exist. She placed the drawing gently back in the folder and looked across the table, her gaze steady. I can't change what I did, she finished, but I can choose who I become from here forward. I hope you'll allow me to prove that. If not, I will still carry these lessons into everything I do. The room stayed quiet for a long moment after she spoke. Not the cold silence of judgment, but the thoughtful silence of people genuinely considering her words. Finally, Judith leaned back in her chair, her hands folded. She exchanged glances with the other board members. Charles Reed gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. Judith looked back at Brittany. "Miss Cole," she said carefully, "Horizon Airways does not expect perfection from our employees, but we do expect accountability, growth, and integrity. Based on the work you have completed, the honesty you have shown, and the endorsement provided by multiple supervisors from your community service site." Brittany's heart hammered against her ribs. "We are reinstating your employment, effective immediately." The words floated in the air, heavy with meaning. "However," Judith continued, her voice firmer now, "your reinstatement comes with conditions. You will be placed on a 6-month probation period. Any further misconduct will result in immediate termination without review. You will also be assigned as a mentor for new flight attendants, teaching them not only about procedures, but about respect, dignity, and inclusion." Brittany's breath hitched. She nodded quickly, swallowing back the wave of emotion rising in her throat. "Thank you," she said, voice thick but genuine. "Thank you for trusting me." Charles leaned forward slightly, speaking softer than before. "Don't waste it." "I won't," Brittany whispered. The meeting closed, and as Brittany walked out of the room, she didn't rush. She didn't hide. She moved with the steady, grounded steps of someone who had fallen, been broken, but had chosen to rise differently. Outside the building, the sky was brilliant and clear, the sun slicing through the early afternoon air. She stood there for a long moment, breathing it in. For the first time in months, she wasn't carrying the crushing weight of shame. She was carrying something else, something harder but better, responsibility. Her uniform would wait. Her next flight would wait. There was no rush anymore, because Brittany knew now that real change didn't come at cruising altitude, with polished shoes and tight smiles. Real change started on the ground, messy and raw and painful, and beautiful, exactly where it mattered most. 2 days later, Brittany stood once again at the employee entrance of the airport terminal, uniform neatly pressed, badge clipped back onto her blazer. This time, the fabric on her shoulders felt heavier, not because she feared the work ahead, but because she understood it now. Every thread of that uniform was a responsibility, not to the airline, not even to the rules, but to every soul she would meet from here on. Walking through the halls, familiar faces greeted her with polite nods. Some smiled warmly, while others showed a colder politeness, unsure how to treat her now. Brittany didn't blame them. Trust wasn't a coat you could slip back into overnight. Trust had to be earned again, layer by layer, moment by moment. She reported for duty early, arriving at the crew lounge before anyone else. Sitting alone at one of the small round tables, she reviewed her flight assignment for the day. It wasn't a glamorous international route or a high-profile business shuttle. It was a simple domestic flight, Atlanta to Kansas City and back. In the past, she might have felt disappointed at such an ordinary route. Now she welcomed it. Every passenger, every seat, every interaction, they were her new starting line. As the rest of the crew filtered in, Brittany noticed Heather Blake, the senior flight attendant from the day of the incident, among them. Heather gave her a slow, searching look, then walked over and sat down across from her without asking. "Good to see you back," Heather said simply, no judgment in her voice. Brittany smiled softly. "Good to be back." Heather tapped her fingers lightly on the table, studying her for a moment. "Word travels fast around here," she said. "People know what happened. Some are watching you, seeing what you'll do next." "I know," Brittany said. She didn't flinch. She welcomed it. Heather leaned back slightly, her expression thoughtful. "You'll be working with the new hires today. They're green, nervous. Some will think they know it all. Others will be terrified. Be patient." "I will," Brittany promised. The boarding process began smoothly. Brittany positioned herself at the front of the plane, greeting passengers with genuine warmth. Every "good morning," every "welcome aboard" was said with meaning, not out of habit. She noticed things she had never bothered to see before. The tight smile of a father traveling alone with two restless kids, the tired eyes of a woman balancing a briefcase and a stroller, the hesitation in a young man clutching his first-ever plane ticket like it might disappear. She saw them now, truly saw them, and that seeing changed everything. Halfway through the boarding, one of the new hires, a young man named Ethan, approached her nervously. He held out the passenger manifest with shaking hands. "I think I made a mistake seating someone," he whispered, panic in his voice. Brittany took the manifest and scanned it quickly. A woman seated in economy was actually listed under a first-class booking. She smiled reassuringly at Ethan. "It's all right," she said softly. "We'll fix it. Mistakes happen." Together they approached the woman, apologized sincerely, and moved her to her rightful seat in first class. Brittany caught the woman's surprised but grateful smile as she settled into her proper place. Walking back to the galley, Brittany turned to Ethan. "Do you know what the most important part of our job is?" she asked. Ethan frowned slightly. "Safety?" "Safety is critical, of course," Brittany said, her tone patient. "But beyond that, respect, making sure every person on this plane feels seen, heard, and valued, no matter where they sit." Ethan nodded slowly, the words settling into him. Brittany could see it happen, the small shift, the beginning of real understanding. Later, during beverage service, Brittany caught her own reflection in the polished surface of the coffee pot. For a moment, she barely recognized herself. Not because she looked different, but because the woman in the reflection was no longer rushing to judge or control. She was there to serve, not from a place of pride, but from a place of humility and strength. When the plane touched down in Kansas City, the captain made the usual landing announcement, thanking the passengers for flying with them. Brittany stood by the front door, smiling warmly as passengers filed out. Some nodded, some thanked her sincerely. One older gentleman paused before exiting. His suit was rumpled from travel, and his briefcase looked battered from years of use. He looked her directly in the eye and said, "Thank you for treating me like I mattered." Brittany's throat tightened unexpectedly. She smiled and nodded, unable to speak for a moment. After the last passenger left, and the cabin fell into quiet, Brittany leaned against the jump seat for a moment, closing her eyes. Maybe most people would forget this flight as soon as they walked into their next meeting, their next hotel room. But Brittany wouldn't forget. She would remember every face, every word, every small moment of connection. Because redemption wasn't a dramatic event. It was this, the everyday choice to do better, to be better. And for the first time in a long time, Brittany Cole was exactly where she needed to be. Not just on the plane, but within herself. The return flight to Atlanta passed under a sky-tinted orange and gold by the late afternoon sun. Clouds floated like islands far below, and the hum of the engines was steady and comforting. The passengers settled in quietly, the soft clink of ice in plastic cups and the occasional page-turning of a magazine filling the cabin with a gentle rhythm. Brittany moved through the aisles with quiet purpose, checking on passengers with a genuine smile, adjusting a blanket here, offering water there. Every small act felt meaningful now. Every interaction was a reminder of how far she had traveled. Not in miles, but in understanding. She wasn't perfect. She never would be. But she was awake now in a way she hadn't been before. Midway through the flight, she paused in the galley, taking a moment to sip a glass of water. Ethan, the new hire, approached her with a grin, looking far more relaxed than he had at the beginning of the day. "You make it look easy," he said. Brittany chuckled softly. "It's not," she replied. "It's just worth it." He nodded thoughtfully and returned to his duties, leaving Brittany alone with her thoughts. She looked out the small window, watching the endless stretch of sky and the fading horizon. A thought struck her then. How small the world looked from up here. How tiny all the things that had once seemed so important now felt. Reputation, pride, appearances, all of it shrank under the vastness of the open sky. As they began their descent into Atlanta, Brittany prepared the cabin for landing. She moved through her checklist carefully, methodically, but her mind wandered back to the boy at the shelter, to the crayon drawing he had given her. She had folded that paper carefully and placed it in her locker, where it waited for her return, a simple reminder of the moment she truly began to change. The wheels touched down with a gentle bump, and the familiar skyline of Atlanta rose to greet them. Passengers stirred, gathering their belongings, stretching tired limbs. Brittany stood by the door, ready to say her goodbyes. One by one, passengers filed past her. A mother carrying a sleeping baby mouthed, "Thank you," with a tired but grateful smile. A teenager with a skateboard tucked under his arm flashed her a thumbs up. An elderly woman placed a wrinkled hand on Brittany's arm and said quietly, "You made this flight feel special." Each word, each gesture, wrapped around Brittany like a soft armor, not to shield her from judgment, but to remind her that she was doing it right this time. Not perfect, but present. Not flawless, but real. As the last passenger exited, the crew began their final checks. Heather approached Brittany at the door, her arms crossed casually. "You did good today," Heather said simply. "Thanks," Brittany replied, smiling. Heather tilted her head slightly. "You ever think about becoming a lead attendant?" Brittany laughed lightly, surprised. "I don't know. I think I have a lot more to learn first." Heather shrugged. "We all do. Leadership's not about being finished. It's about knowing you never are." The words hit Brittany harder than Heather probably realized. She nodded, a lump forming in her throat. Later, walking through the terminal toward the employee exit, Brittany caught sight of a figure standing near a quiet corner. A tall man in a dark suit, polished but simple. He wasn't surrounded by security or assistants. He stood alone, calmly checking his watch. Leonard Brooks. Their eyes met across the distance. He gave the smallest nod, not of recognition but of respect. Brittany stopped uncertain for a moment, then gathered herself and walked toward him. "Mr. Brooks," she said, her voice steady. "Miss Cole," he replied, his tone even. They stood for a moment in silence, a silence filled with more meaning than 1,000 words. "I just wanted to thank you," Brittany said finally, her voice low. "Not for saving my job, but for giving me a reason to be better." Leonard studied her for a long moment, then offered a small, approving smile. "Everyone falls," he said. "Not everyone stands up the right way." He extended his hand. Brittany shook it firmly, feeling the strength and grace behind the simple gesture. "Good luck," Leonard said, turning to leave. But Brittany knew luck had nothing to do with it anymore. She watched him disappear into the crowd, feeling the last pieces of her old self finally slip away. Stepping back into the terminal, she moved forward with a steady heart. She wasn't chasing titles or proving herself to others anymore. She was building something better, something that couldn't be taken away by a mistake or a harsh judgment. Respect, integrity, humanity, the things that would make her flights different from now on. The things that would make her life different from now on. And as Brittany Cole blended into the crowd, just another uniform among thousands, she carried with her a lesson too important to ever forget. The greatest seat of all isn't in first class. It's in how you carry yourself, and how you lift others along the way. If you liked this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories coming your way soon.